Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Weldon, and I'm a PhD student at Cornell University, here as part of the Great Lakes Hop Working Group to give a deep dive discussion on hop powdery mildew disease identification and management. So just a little bit of personal background. My advisor is Dr. David Gadori, and we are based out of Cornell Agritech, which is in Geneva, New York, at the New York State Agricultural Experiment Station, which is a research campus of Cornell University. My dissertation focus is on population biology and epidemiology of hop powdery mildew, which has a larger overall theme of applied management of hop powdery mildew. Before I dive right into talking only about powdery mildew, I think it's crucial to talk about why you really need to know the differences in identification between downy and powdery mildew and why that is so important. So the two organisms responsible for downy mildew and powdery mildew belong to completely different kingdoms on the evolutionary tree. And so we have a simple evolutionary tree here on the right, and you can see plants on one branch, you have animals on another branch, you have bacteria down here very early on the evolutionary tree, which makes sense. But the two branches that I want to focus on are fungi and this branch over here that's called oomycetes. And the reason I want to focus on those two is because the organism that causes hop powdery mildew belongs to this branch fungi. It is a fungus. However, the organism that causes hop downy mildew, it is often called and referred to as a fungus, but it is not truly a fungus. It is not on this branch. It is actually on the branch of oomycetes. And so they are very distantly related, just like plants and animals are distantly related. And you could liken this to them both being natural disasters. They're both capable of causing large amounts of destruction within the hop yard, but one being a fire and one being a tornado. You would respond to these two in completely different ways. And in fact, the way that you'd respond to a fire in your house by leaving your house would be the worst move that you could ever make. In the actual reality of a tornado, you'd probably get swept away by the tornado if that was actually the case. Well, this relates kind of back to downy mildew and powdery mildew because they generally require different fungicides for good specific control. So they are fire and tornado in relation to what fungicides they require in order to control these two pathogens. Most modern fungicides designed to control powdery mildew do little to nothing to manage downy mildew and vice versa. So it is crucial that when you're identifying which disease is out in your yard, that you're confident in making that diagnosis so that then you can move forward and appropriately choose what disease management strategies and chemicals you choose to control the problem. Okay, so now we can focus on exclusively powdery mildew for the rest of our time. So I'm going to cover some background on the disease, move into some identification strategies, quick comment on varietal resistance, and then focus on management practices through scouting, some cultural practices, and then management through use of fungicides. So a bit of background on hop powdery mildew. Like I said, it's caused by a fungus, Podosphera macularis, and this is data out of the Pacific Northwest that growers spend about $740 per hectare on chemical control and get about a 15% annual yield loss still due to damage caused by powdery mildew. It's important to note that this organism is an obligate biotroph, and this means that this pathogen needs living hop tissue in order to be able to grow. So it can't grow in the soil like some fungi, it can't grow on bark, it can't grow on other plants. It needs living hop tissue specifically. It is directly and intimately tied to hop tissue in order to grow. Like many of us know, the reason that we care about hop powdery mildew is because of the damage that it directly does to hop cones. So it causes stunting, browning, and distortion of the alpha and beta acid profiles of hop cones, which results in rejection for use in the brewing process. So the pathogen can overwinter in one of two ways. It can overwinter asexually, or it can overwinter through a sexual process. The asexual process, so asexual infection of dormant hop buds, is what we commonly associate with the pathogen. So this is the white, fluffy mycelial growth of the fungus that is the namesake for hop powdery mildew. And when this growth extends down onto the hop buds that either go dormant or semi-dormant just below the soil line, at a very, very low rate of less than 1%. Those buds will emerge the following spring, having survived the stresses of the winter, and they will emerge also infected with the powdery mildew pathogen. And so we see this here on the right. These shoots are termed flag shoots when they're infected with hop powdery mildew. And they're called that because they stick out like a flag in comparison to all of the other green leaf tissue that's surrounding it. Like I said, this happens at a very low rate, which is good from an initial disease pressure standpoint, but it also means that you need to be scouting vigilantly in order to do a good job of finding these out in your yard and removing them before they spread the disease too much and get disease going. This picture is to demonstrate that this flag shoot here was pretty cryptically kind of hidden within some of the basal foliage of surrounding otherwise healthy looking hop tissue. And sometimes flag shoots can be buried within these microclimates where they're protected by other hop leaves, and they're in this nice shaded kind of cool climate, which is optimal for powdery mildew growth. And so when you're scouting, you need to be vigilantly scouting not only on the surface, but actually be digging within some of the basal foliage to see if there's any flag shoots that have emerged that you can't see just on a pass by. The other way that the pathogen can overwinter is through a sexual reproduction process, where it produces these overwintering structures called chasmathecia. And kind of interestingly, like mammals, this fungal species has two mating types. It has two genders, essentially. And so when spores of both genders land on the same leaf and grow in their typical white, fluffy form of asexual growth, if those two growing fronts overlap, wherever they overlap, they will recognize one another and initiate sexual reproduction of this overwintering structure. And so this leaf here on the left, instead of seeing lots and lots of white powdery growth, we're seeing these brown chasmathecia structures, and each one of these little black specks is an individual chasmathecia. So there can be thousands on one leaf. Under the microscope, what they actually look like is they're like shells, they're like cases that on the inside house a sac that is protecting spores that when this chasmathecia, the brown structure, cracks open in the spring, it releases these spores, and should these spores land on any surrounding susceptible hop tissue, would perenniate the disease into the following season. It is thought that chasmathecia as an overwintering source are much more efficient than the asexual kind of white growth that happens on dormant buds that produces flag shoots, but it's not known to what degree they are better. But it's also important to note that through all of kind of the population analysis and scouting that we've done in the Pacific Northwest and in the Midwest and the Eastern US, for the vast majority of commercial yards, there's only one mating type that we've found in the majority of those yards. And so those growers don't necessarily need to be modifying their disease management program in response to this sexual structure, because it's not forming in their yards. They only have one gender in their yard, and so this structure can't form. And so it's important to be scouting for it. It's important to be on the lookout for it, but you don't need to make any modifications to your disease management program until you know it's in your yard. And you would see that in the fall and make modifications and know that you have kind of a higher initial disease pressure going into that following spring. So now getting into some proper identification. So what to physically look for in the yard. Early in the spring, the first thing that you're going to look for, obviously, are the flag shoots. And so these emerge in your first and your second waves of buds that break ground, and they can emerge potentially infected at a very low rate. And because it happens at a very low rate, you need to make sure that you're vigilant in scouting for these, because this is your first effort at removing that initial source of inoculum within your hop yard. For the rest of the growing season, what you're on the lookout for is just the typical white powdery growth that could be happening on any green tissue on your hop plants. So under the microscope, the spores of powdery mildew actually look like kind of transparent, non-pigmented little beads that are stacked up in chains as such. But to the naked eye, when you look at them kind of macroscopically, it looks like this white, fluffy, powdery growth. So where on the plant can a disease be found? Powdery mildew can be found growing on all green plant tissue, and this includes both sides of the leaves, young hop stems and shoots, on the hop cones, obviously. And the reason I underlined both sides of the leaves is because that is in stark contrast to downy mildew, in which the spores of the downy mildew pathogen can only be produced on the underside of hop leaves. And so if you're doing any sort of scouting and you see spore production on the top side of the leaf surface, as in this picture here, that's a strong indicator that if you're considering powdery versus downy, this would make you lean towards powdery mildew being what you're dealing with. It's important to note that powdery mildew cannot cause systemic infection that risks killing the hop crown, like is the case for hop downy mildew, but it still can perenniate on the dormant buds, as we previously talked about. One additional factor that can help you just get in the right mindset for knowing which disease is likely to be in your yard is to know the optimal conditions for powdery mildew and also downy mildew as a comparison. So typically seasons favor high prevalence of one disease over the other. So in the case of powdery mildew, these seasons are favored, powdery mildew is favored during seasons of temperate, drier conditions. The pathogen, those little bead-like spores, they don't require water to be able to grow and infect. So theoretically, every day is a potential infection period. But because those spores are clear, they're not pigmented, and so UV light from sun exposure can be damaging to them, and so that can be a limiting factor in where they can grow. Downy mildew, just for comparison, it's strongly favored by wet, rainy seasons. The spores that downy mildew produces actually do require water in order to be able to infect. And so seasons of rain and high humidity and long dew periods, those are the seasons where you would lean towards suspecting downy mildew being a problem, more so than powdery. One quick comment about varietal resistance. This is a PDF that is available on the Cornell hops webpage. And this is a table from one of our documents that we have available online. And it's just showing kind of the most up-to-date knowledge on varieties resistant to powdery mildew in the US, some varieties that have recently lost resistance. So the Nugget variety in the Pacific Northwest, there's a strain of powdery mildew that's overcome that resistance, and also strains of powdery mildew that are adapted to grow on Cascade, which was a previously resistant variety. So getting into management practices for powdery mildew. So the first line of defense is always to choose resistant varieties when possible. I know that breweries and brewery demand plays a large role in which varieties get planted. And so at least understanding the general level of susceptibility to powdery mildew when it's not possible to choose a resistant variety is crucial as well. This is especially important for organic production, and knowing kind of the resistance profile of the varieties that are planted in your yard will guide your scouting intensity as well as your spray program intensity right off the bat as you start your yard and going into the season. In terms of scouting, you should scout as soon as the shoots emerge and scout as often as possible, as often as can be handled by your operation. The most critical scouting periods for powdery mildew are at shoot emergence, because this is when you're looking for the flag shoots. At shoot training, because this is when you're choosing kind of your 3 or 4 best shoots to string. And you should be looking in the basal foliage surrounding that to see if there's any powdery mildew that might start to creep up the trellis. And your most critical time is 1 week prior to bloom through 4 weeks post bloom, because those are when your juvenile hop cones, the burrs, are most susceptible to powdery mildew. So a general scouting approach when disease pressure is low is to scout about 100 to 200 plants or hills evenly dispersed among varieties and throughout your yard. Pay special attention to the basal foliage as well as any young still developing hop cones and leaves. You're looking for white powdery colonies on any of these tissues. And should you suspect powdery mildew in any case, you can remove the questionable shoot, place it inside of a Ziploc bag with a slightly damp paper towel to kind of keep the humidity up. Store it at room temperature in a spot that gets a daily light dark cycle, and then check for production of spores one day and 2 days later, and that would be a way. If there's powdery mildew present there, you're going to start to see production of spores. You'll see sporulation. So some of the cultural practices that you can do, these cultural practices are the legwork to make your fungicides work better. They're to take pressure off of your fungicides being kind of the last line of defense, and kind of take the stress off of your fungicides. And so these are things that you should always be doing each season. One of them, pruning. So this is the act of cutting back the first wave of growth. And you shouldn't do this your first or probably your second year of production, but once your varieties start to get a little bit more vigorous in their growth, you cut back that first wave of shoots that emerge from the ground, and this cuts away any potentially infected hop material that is emerging and permeating powdery mildew or downy mildew or any other possible diseases. The frequency and the intensity of your pruning is dependent upon the age of your yard, and also the vigor of your varieties, how vigorously each of your varieties is growing. Generally, mechanical pruning is more effective, but there's also just this fact that any pruning is better than no pruning. In terms of training times, it is best to try and get your shoots out of that basal foliage as soon as possible. I know that there are timing considerations in terms of reaching the top of the trellis to induce production of lateral branches, but the sooner you can get your primary kind of most optimal shoots up and trained away from all the basal foliage, the sooner they'll be away from kind of that microclimate where powdery mildew and downy mildew are likely to kind of rear their heads. The last kind of cultural practice to consider is stripping the lower leaves. So this is breaking the green bridge. And so this picture here, you can see this green bridge of green hop shoots and leaves that if there was any sort of disease going on along the ground here, this would be an easy highway for the pathogen to spread up these two adjacent plants. And so again, you probably wouldn't want to do this the first couple years of your yard, but once your plants are growing vigorously and once they reach a certain height, so about 10 feet, you could strip off the lower 3 feet of growth, and this breaks that green bridge and also induces some airflow along the soil line, which removes that high humidity microclimate associated with kind of the basal foliage. So the last thing to comment on is fungicides in terms of management. And so it's important to know your fungicides. Know which fungicides apply to downy mildew versus powdery mildew, and check the label if you're unsure. There are many application decisions to make beyond the label, and you want to save your big guns for your most critical management periods, especially that time around bloom. So these are fungicides that are generally specific to powdery mildew. I won't go into them into detail, but they're here as examples and as a resource for you to use. Again, these are examples. The product should always be used according to the label in your given state, and you should make contact with your cooperative extension personnel or your regional personnel and make sure that each product is labeled for hops. So these next few slides are credit to Dave Gent out of Oregon State. And this is another just resource that I wanted to include in the PowerPoint deck as more examples of fungicides that are available for use. But again, check whether they're available and legal to use in your area. So this slide here, again provided by Dave, is intended to show that really under high disease pressure, high pressure of powdery mildew, is when you start to see discrepancy in how your fungicides perform. But if you can keep your disease pressure, your powdery mildew pressure moderate to low, which is done through kind of being very good about your cultural practices, all of your fungicides perform quite well in comparison to the untreated. And so this is really what you're aiming for, is to be good about your cultural practices and keep it under this moderate pressure so that you don't need to be relying quite as heavily on fungicides to be the factor that is keeping your percent cone infection at a satisfactory level. This slide here is also from Dave, and it is here as a resource and is intended to provide some context in terms of timing of fungicide applications. The important things to note here are that some of our bigger guns, such as Vivando or Quintec or Luna and Pristine, they're all around flowering, and they're used at that time to protect the hop cones as much as possible, because that is the direct harvestable product that we're trying to protect, and so you time them around at that time. And so with that, I want to thank you all for your time. I have my contact information listed here. Feel free to email me with any follow-up questions that you may have, and I will be happy to get in touch with you. Thank you very much.